Hi everyone, welcome to Pax8 Academy, and I am Dana from the Apex side of Academy, and we have here Nathan who will be joining us today. So today we're going to talk about process documentation and if there is a perfect system or program for it. So I'll be throwing in questions, Nathan, and for my first question. Um, do you have when you say process documentation, what comes to your mind?
So when I'm thinking process documentation, I'm thinking the steps that are required to achieve an output or an outcome. So, following sequential steps, flow of work of
Mm-hmm.
I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I get this
Yeah.
output, a tangible result that results in, client getting an outcome, getting a service, getting a product, or a task being fulfilled, essentially.
Yeah, I think the same way. So, when it comes to like process documentation, I find it that people see it as something that's time consuming
hmm
or, hard to create. Um, you know, when it comes to like starting process documentation or the act of doing it. Um, do you have like any tips for getting it started? At least getting it started.
In terms of a point to start with, yeah, absolutely. So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Or
so
perhaps like what should be like our perception of it to get it started?
mm, I think we overcomplicate it when we want to get started with process documentation as a very beginning point anyway. And there's a perception there that you need to be super process driven or a process genius and you're really good at doing workflows and mapping things out to even get started. But the
Mm-hmm.
reality is when it comes to documenting processes, if you're the person looking to create them and it's based off the work that you're doing, you're already doing it. You're already doing the work. You know how it's done. You know the steps. A starting point really is to just write out how you're doing it currently. If we're talking about very, very foundational, fundamental getting started writing a process, start writing out the steps that it takes to do something. What was that number one? What was that number two? What was that number three? What was that number four? What you
Mm-hmm.
might find is because you're more familiar with how the steps to take to do something are, you might miss out, something between 2 and 4, and you might miss out something between 5 and 6 as well. So there's additional steps missed because it's just implied knowledge. You know how to do it. You kind of forget around the things that you may have found difficult in the past. But starting with those is better than starting with nothing or starting with something completely in your
Yeah.
head.
Mm-hmm.
So as a very, very beginning point, what I'm usually suggesting is write out the steps, 1 to however many it took you to get there. Start there. You can work on flows and diagrams and other things like that at a later point, but as a general rule, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 gets this outcome. Now give it to someone who doesn't know how to do it and see if they can follow it and find out what was missing in
Yeah.
those things.
Mm-hmm.
Another really easy thing to do is just do a screen capture, record yourself fulfilling the task, doing the work, doing the steps, and hand that down to someone to follow who also doesn't know it. Maybe they can write out the steps as well if you're busy. Say you're an owner in a business.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's just a matter of like perception that sometimes we struggle in starting it? Does also this is I mean what we're using, the tool that we're using is also a factor to that, or maybe there's an attached like role to it, that's why it's not yet getting started, the process documentation itself.
Yes, I agree. That's definitely something that hinders a lot of people from getting started. And I've talked to places where they're saying, we want to get a process specialist or a continual improvement manager, or things that aren't actually necessary for your business, particularly if you're in a smaller, to medium-sized business. Start with just outlining, something that you do that you need to hand down. So, like, just go back to when the processes actually become important for a business. And usually when that business is less dependent on one person knowing how to do something and they just know it inherently because they've done it day in, day out. Say you've started adding people to your organization, now's a good time to start. You get further and further away from the details, something I see a lot of managers and people transitioning into management or senior leadership roles. They get further and further from the details. They don't know how to do it. They're less involved. Another reason why we should look at process documentation. We need others to pick up the work, so you can focus on something else. Often a need to document that process to get started. You're focused on growth, you wanted to create consistency, you want to have repeatable and scalable steps that others can do. These are all reasons why you would do it. Everyone in your organization will have a reason that ties in or contributes to something like that. So when it comes to creating the documentation, I think it's everybody's responsibility, was a very roundabout way of getting towards that. But it's not a case of you have a specialist or you have someone who knows how to do it. Everyone knows how to do something within your business. When you're looking at what to create, what is something that's purely dependent on me? Or another thing I often tell people to do, think about something, or as you're working through something you found difficult, what did I find difficult about this? Was there anything I could follow? What could I do to make it less difficult for other people? And start there. Like I said, it doesn't need to be a fully defined, 20-page document with, 7 different workflows and swim lanes and other things like that. Start really basic. Just what can I do that's going to make it a little bit easier for everyone? And if everyone else carries through that mindset around, I found something difficult, I made it easier, paying it forward essentially, you'll also get paid back in the future as well.
I'm supposed to ask about the process specialist, like if it's required for businesses to hire process specialists just for a start, and what kind of like information they should put in. And I think you've also touched base those things, like process specialist doesn't need to be as a starter, you don't need to like hire the process specialist right away, especially if you're a small business. And then the other one that you mentioned about the details, like the basic details, because I think there's a part there wherein people can get caught up with so much details, check in everything, and then end up having a more confused documentation rather than a helpful one. But aside those things, are there any roadblocks or limitations you think that businesses are making when starting with process documentation?
Like you said, focusing on the information that isn't really important is something I see a lot of. And I think widening the scope of things that aren't important, we really need to hone in and focus on that, because the minute details of, what would be, the small minor text in a otherwise overall big picture. Sometimes we don't need to go into that level of detail, particularly starting. Like, as I said, just spending 10 minutes writing down just a step 1 to 10 is better than spending 2 months in your spare time whenever you get a chance trying to perfect this process that no one's actually using or following. So getting a start somewhere and then building on it. I think if you take an iterative approach to your documentation and you just continually refine it as you're going through and finding things didn't work or were missing, you're going to be a lot better off, because you're also going to get the tangible benefits of having a process to follow. Say I don't have a process to follow, it's inconsistent, it might be wasteful, I might spend a lot of time, I have to reinvent the wheel every time. Me spending up to 10, 20 minutes writing out something as a starting point, as a baseline for people to follow, have actually saved us tens or hundreds of hours in the long run while I was spending that time trying to perfect it. So that's an area I see people get stuck. And when I'm talking around widening the scope, I'm thinking specifically around things like texts, what texts, formatting, logos, how the paragraphs are laid out. A lot of things that don't make a vital process useful or available to staff are often the things that we struggle and stagnate on the most. What system are we going to put it in? Will it be, this, that, or the other? As a starting point, if you have the processes and they're not available to people, people aren't following them. That's the most important thing, creating that consistency, getting it available to people. So whatever you're using, start basic, start simple, give it to people so they can reap the rewards and the benefits, and make it available to people so they can actually see it and follow it as well.
You mentioned something about system or
Mm.
maybe the platform or tools that they're using. And there are so many out there,
Mm.
offering different features and benefits.
Mhm.
Are there any like platforms or tools that you can recommend, or the best ones there out there?
This is probably one of the areas where I'm the most indifferent, in all honesty, around the tools. It's really figuring out which things best suit your business. What is it that you're wanting to get out of your documentation before you're determining what system. So if you have requirements for things like configuration management to tie in with it, passwords, password management, there's a lot of tools out there on the market that'll meet those. But if it's a case of, as I said before, you're starting from absolutely nowhere and you have nothing
Yeah.
documented, some documents in whatever your typical program is for writing up documents and wherever you're storing them, as long as it's a central location, it's fine. Like
Hmm.
having Word documents on a file server is a starting point, as
Hmm.
opposed to having everything in your head. So I honestly wouldn't or can't recommend, from my perspective, one specific system that will solve all your issues. I think the main thing is having something to begin with and then looking at what your requirements are. Like, is there a visual requirement? Do you want to have videos? Do you want to have diagrams? Do you need to have, network diagrams and ANS builds and things like that as well? Does it need to tie in with your PSA or your ticketing system? Those are the types of things that you know or will understand as a business. But
Hmm.
again, that shouldn't stop you from getting started with today. Now, if you're not documenting anything, start with some basic 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps. Uh, just outline them. Even use Excel. It doesn't have to be anything fancy to start with.
That's a good point. It's a good point. But we've mentioned, we've been talking about starting it. Who do you think is the one should be starting it? I mean, the process documentation. I mean, do we have to like assign someone, or there should be really a person who rolls this out?
Mm. Something I've been doing lately with a couple of organizations is working through RACI, so who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed. And we've been looking at all the different steps, interactions, points of contact, or whatever it is that happen throughout to deliver, the goal. So say it's your project delivery, your service delivery, here's the steps along the way. We're not
Mm-hmm.
really getting into the depths of the service documentation of how that process works, but we're identifying who's responsible, who's accountable, who's doing the work for that. From
Okay.
there, we can use that as a way to actually identify some of the gaps as well. Like, does this have a process? Does it need a process? And if it needs a process and it has a process, the accountable, the responsible people, we can create, tickets in our PSA to create a document, or you can use Microsoft List and say, here's a process that we need to create. I'm assigning it to this person,
Mm-hmm.
and we have this date behind it. I don't think it should be anyone's sole responsibility for creating documentation, because that will create problems with the flow of work unless you've got someone whose job is only to document, which, as I said, overhead that a lot of organizations won't necessarily have the budget for. Also, wouldn't really get much benefit out of it, because the people that would be documenting the work wouldn't be the people that were doing the work and understood the work as well. So when it comes
Mm-hmm.
to who's responsible, I think it's everyone's responsibility. I think there should be someone who's accountable for overseeing the documentation within specific functions and roles within the business, but everyone should be contributing to that and contributing to it regularly, whether that's your booking in an allowance if you're really heavy on time entry, or it's just a case of we're creating a list and people are picking up something a week and working on it, or it's just ad hoc of, hey, I went in, I couldn't find a process for this, so I'm just going to write out what I did, or I'm going to record
Mm-hmm.
what I did, and that's a starting point.
It's great. One of the things that I've struggled when I was starting with process documentation, like it's very new to me and it was just like
Mm,
handed to me as a task. The challenge that I had is making time for it. So I'm
yeah,
no,
sure.
I'm just I'm curious, like how do I make time for it? Like this is time
Mm.
consuming. I don't want to do this. It's blocking my work time. So how do I make time for that process documentation? I mean, just for a start.
Mm. Yeah, sure. So, yeah, it's the thing I hear often as well, is that I don't have time. Let's say that you're a technical person and you're doing something specific to a client. You've worked on a ticket and you need to document the steps that you've done. Document them there as part of that ticket. take the time while you've got it to do it so that you don't forget about it and go back to it. But anyone that's doing anything like this or anything that's lesser around the actual delivery and more around focusing on how can we improve the way that we work, deliver better value, deliver it quicker, deliver it more consistent, schedule some time in, an hour a day or, an hour a week if you don't have that much time available. Like I was saying before, use something like a Microsoft list for the processes that do need to be documented, and maybe assign yourself one every week that you're going to focus on rather than trying to create end-to-end documentation. Have a starting point of, at a very, very loose level, here's the basics to do this thing, here's the basics to do that thing. And then at a later time, as you've built out some of those processes, go back and review them, improve them, look at how they touch and work in with each other as well, see if there's any constraints or issues that are happening as you're developing them with more maturity as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. Scheduling a time, being intentional and having a
Yeah.
time for that. But do you think it will also help if we, let's say, I'm trying to document it at the same time that I'm doing, the process? Do you think that will also help?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I was saying before, one of the easiest things we can do is go, I don't have a process for this. I'm going to record myself going through the process. If it's, you're on your computer and you're doing it, record myself on the computer as I'm doing it, play it back at 2x speed, watch it, write out your steps at a later point. So yeah, say that I'm doing something now, it's a technical in-depth process, I've never done it before, or it's been 6 months. That used to be something that I find something I do once a year. I'd forget how to do it, remember it as I went through it, forget it, move on. I'm going to go through this thing. We need a process for it. What I'm going to do is just start doing a screen record as I go through those steps, and I'm going to book time in on Friday for an hour to write out the steps from what I recorded, play that recording back at 2x speed, and just write, like I was saying before, basically the bullet point highlights of here's what I did to get to there. That could be an easy way to get started.
Mm-hmm. I like that. I mean, I like that you mentioned about recording. I never thought about that. And yeah, it's a good point because you highlighted in there that there are many ways on how to document it. Sometimes not people is very into typing things. So
reading,
yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So recording can also be a good idea. So I think you mentioned a while ago about storage or finding it in a specific spot. So can you tell me more about that part? I mean, what's the importance of that? Finding it in the specific spot or having a specific spot for that, for your documentation.
So having a single source of truth is something we'll talk around a lot with businesses that we're working with, and it's widely understood within the industry. And that single source of truth doesn't necessarily mean all of your documentation sits in one place, but say all of your internal and HR documentation sit in your HR system. You know that that's where they sit, that's where you go and find them. So you're not going and looking where your technical documentation is. What you don't want to have happen is that you've got 5 different locations to look for documentation, because then that becomes inefficient. It'll become inefficient because, hey, I don't know how to do something. I've checked the OneNote, I've checked the SharePoint, I've checked the IT Glue, I've checked this. None of those things have it. And then someone comes back and goes, oh, it's on our Confluence that we had 4 years ago. Those types of things happen. And it wastes time and it makes it inefficient. The other side is someone who thinks that the documentation doesn't exist and they didn't think Confluence. They go, oh, I'll create it on SharePoint. Someone else forgets that they had Confluence 4 years ago. I'll create it on OneDrive or OneNote. Now you've got 2, 3, 4 different versions of a process or a document or a standard operating procedure floating about. Which one do I follow? And are all the steps valid? Are we introducing new risk? Do we need to have some level of peer review on our documentation that just won't be there now? That can create problems, particularly if now your technology standards change. Let's say we're looking at standard operating procedures and we have to configure it with these IP addresses or these naming conventions or these subnets or this disk configuration. Things like that will also impact the consistency that you're delivering. And then you're losing one of the key benefits of why you have documentation or standard operating procedures and processes to begin with, because now it's all sitting in different locations. We've got 4 different things that say 4 different things themselves. Which one am I following? Now someone wants to pick it up and support it. Is there a single playbook that I'm I'm calling back to, or is there not?
Mm-hmm. Having those different locations for those documentations, do you
Hmm.
think it's something that has to do, let's say, the person documenting it finds that this system is perfect for me, and then another person saying this one is perfect for me? Do you think it comes from that?
Sometimes, yes, people will do what's easiest for them often, and you end
Mm-hmm.
up with, silos and knowledge silos. And um, some of the biggest risks sometimes to businesses as well is around keeping that IP, that documentation, that knowledge, readily available to them and knowing where it is. Can we find it? Can others see it? That person leaves. Did we just have someone leave and we have no idea that there's all this processes created that we now have to recreate from scratch, or we have to backwards engineer because they were the only person who knew how to do this, or
Mm-hmm.
those types of things as well can definitely happen.
Okay, okay. How can we like minimize that? So,
Mm,
I mean, people putting things everywhere.
mm,
Like I started my documentation and people are doing their own thing. How can
mm.
I make sure that, we're keeping this in one place and we can locate this in one place or system?
Well, it depends on what system you're using really and what the purpose is for them. But having, like a table of reference, table of content type thing, like you would in a document, but it just says, in a table somewhere, for a document about this, documentation about this, it sits in this system. For documentation about this, it sits in this system. Uh, have a look, see if people are putting stuff in the right places. Continually reinforce it as well. Oh, I've had trouble doing this on XYZ client. Well, that needs to go into that client's folder or that client's location. Like,
Mm-hmm.
continually telling people that, not, oh yeah, just go write it down in OneNote or whatever, suits you
Mm-hmm.
best, and we'll figure out where it sits in a year's time. So pushing that onto the team, and keeping an eye on it really.
Like you've mentioned a while ago that starting starting is I mean it's not actually like finding a perfect system, but it's starting with what works for you and your organization. But do you think like starting with what you have as of the moment, do you think that's also a good way to start? What do you think, Nathan?
Yep, that's pretty much what I'm saying here as well. Start with what you have. If you've got something that you can write down notes
Mm-hmm.
in, that other people can see, you've got the start of your documentation if you don't have anything now. So, yeah, hone in on what it is that you've got. What does it give you? You can look at what you need going forward at a later stage, but as a starting point, identify a couple of things that you need to do. Have a to-do list of the processes or the standard operating procedures that you need where you're noticing that there is lack of clarity, inconsistency, waste happening. Currently, just start really
Mm-hmm.
is my only advice here. Get started, write out something, make it a little bit easier for everyone else. They can make it a little
Mm-hmm.
bit easier for everyone else, and before you know it, you'll have some documentation.
Mm-hmm. Let's just say I wanted to like try on something, a new system. This looks amazing. What do you have any tips like on like trying out a new system? I mean, for business owners, they wanted to try this specific tool. So, do you have any tips like on starting something like that or trying it out?
Start with a business case of what it is that you're wanting to actually get out of it. So,
Mm-hmm.
what are the must-haves? What are the could-haves? What are the should-haves? Et cetera, et cetera. What are the things that you don't need, won't have for your documentation system? Start with some of those things as a general starting point before you go out and try a whole bunch of things and get focused in on
Mm-hmm.
the shiny objects and things like that.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think actually understand the purpose of what it is that you're wanting to get out of it. Like I said before, if you're wanting to have configuration items, or you want it to integrate with your PSA and other things like that, there's a lot of things out of the box that will do that. If that's the things that you need and those are the things that are must-haves that are important to your business, then start by looking for those functionalities out of the box. Don't go looking for something and then using custom-made APIs, and before you know it, you're spending
Mm-hmm.
more time on development than you are on documentation.
Oh,
So
that's good.
be pragmatic, outline what it is that you need, what you want from your documentation systems, um, and then work your way from there. But don't let that get too much in the way of at least just starting with something that you have today as well.
I like that. Mm-hmm. It's outlining what you need before you try out things, because
Mhm.
it can be tempting to try things because there are different like shiny stuff out there. And, just to, I mean, I ask you about like who should be starting it or if there's a
Mm.
perfect system for that. But, just to start a documentation, do you have any tip like what documentation I should start in the business? You know what's How do I identify that? What should I start? I could start anything, but
Uh, if you're an owner or a manager, think about the things that people keep asking you how to do,
that's good.
or asking you for help with. Start with one of those things. Very simply, think off the top of your head. If it's something that you know how to do inside and out, and you do it day in, day out, and it's second nature to you, like I remember things that I would find second nature when I was a tech, that you know less experienced techs would have found difficult. Start with those, and like I said, just you got to do this, 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 and this. Get them to go and find it out. Get them to fill in the gaps, fill in the blanks. Start with something there.
Mm, that's good. That's good. I'm quite curious about this one. Have you have you observed any businesses that get stuck when it comes to like starting process documentation? And with that observation, what tip can you give to other business owners not to get stuck in starting process documentation?
Like I was saying
Maybe three
before, the
things.
three things. Yeah, three things.
Yeah.
Uh, Three things. Don't focus so much on the systems or something that you think you need. Actually validate what it is that you require from a system if you are looking at a system. Don't
That's good.
go out and find four different point solutions and now you've created inconsistency and difficulty for people to know where am I looking, what am I working on, what is the purpose or value that I'm getting out of these things anyway. Find something that meets most of your requirements. Would be one of my key points if you are looking at changing your documentation system. If you don't have any documentation now, like I said, focus on something that you know how to do that others don't. That could be your first process. Start with a list out, just even brainstorming. Here's all the things that I do. None of these things have processes or none of these things have standard operating procedures. And these are important things that I want consistency in. Great. Now you've got a list. Third part would be actually scheduling the time to do it, not just for yourself, but for other people, and reiterating the importance of creating that documentation in your business, so that people aren't the single point of failure, or creating constraints in your business or creating stress for other people as well, because it's not good to be the only person in your business who knows how to do something,
Yeah, I agree. I
because
agree.
it does come with additional weight. Like, can I go on leave, can I be sick, those types of things also will impact people's enjoyment of work-life balance, a whole range of
I
different things
agree.
as well. So
Mhm.
it's around reducing the risk and also reducing the pressure on individuals as well.
Mhm. Thank you for organizing that, Nathan. Those 3 points are a good way to, to look at it in starting the process documentation. And I hope those points that we talk about and discussed will also help other business owners or maybe some process specialists or experts in their organization. So, do you have any like parting thoughts, perhaps, Nathan, before we wrap this up?
Yeah, to wrap it up, I've talked about a bunch of different points that hopefully people can take away and start creating that documentation and those processes and procedures. My big takeaway really is, if you focus on making work a little bit better for everyone around you, whether that be through your process documentation or standard operating procedures, or just helping people through different situations that they're finding, and that's reciprocated, you've already got the foundations of a good high-performing culture or high-performing team. Just continue to focus in on that and really keep that mindset around those things that you do find difficult. How can I make it easier for other people? I think that's a key thing I want to get people focused on
I
and
like that.
thinking of.
I like that, making it easy for other people. So, thank you so much, Nathan. And thank you for answering those questions that I threw in. And Yeah, let's see each other for another session.
Yep, sounds good. Thanks for having me, Danah.
Thank you. Bye.